of it, aware of your own motivation, what is something that motivates you. Whereas the fruits, okay, is something involve our actions, behavior, practice, and outcomes, things that people can see. So now I have the question: what are the things that motivate us? What are our priorities, and what are the most important things in our lives? Okay, so can you think of some? Like what is the most important things in our life? Huh? Well, actually, the Bible, the lessons today give us a few of them. Okay, so because of time, I'm going to just keep moving. So, yeah, I was going to write out. Okay, there are 3 here. Okay, on one side is motivational factors, and on the other side is the character traits related to these factors. Okay, so the motivational factors in 3 of our 3 days of our lessons today is: one is wealth, power, control, and name and reputation. So for wealth is like the character traits would be like selfishness and greed. For power and control, motivational factor, power and control, the character traits would be like ambition. And then for motivational factors, for your name and reputation, the character traits would be like hypocrisy. So they are the 3 character traits that we are talking about today. Okay. So now let's first talk about wealth and selfishness and greed. Okay. Now we all need to have a certain amount of wealth in order to live, right? Don't we? We need to have a job, we need to have income, and we need to have a livelihood, means of livelihood, okay? Now, on the parable of the rich fool, which is in Luke chapter 12, verse 19, okay? There is, from Luke 12, verse 19, that would be the life philosophy of this rich man who is a fool. So he basically said, take life easy and what? And eat, drink, and be merry, okay? That is on Luke chapter, thank you. Yes? Can you hear me now? Okay, so he said, he has a lot of grains, so his motivation is like wealth, okay, hoarding of wealth. And then what is his action? His action would be to build big barns to store all my grains and my goods. And then after he did that, then he can take life easy and eat, drink, and be merry. So that is the things that he want to live, in life. So when I was in medical school, we learned a lot of things, but many of the things we pretty much forgot already. But there are 2 things that I learned, I still remember. That was from the very first orientation of my, when I start medical school in 1981. Orientation, they teach us 2 things, okay? Okay, because medical students, that they are very competitive. They compete against the best students from the other colleges, and then they get into school. So they finally get into the school, and now they have to compete with an even smartest group of students. So the whole place is very competitive. But during the orientation, the associate dean, his name is Dr. William Hooker. So he teaches 2 things. Teaches first, because he recognized that we are very competitive, so he tried to help us tell us that, well, some people would try to climb to the top, and then, but in the process of climbing to the top, and you kind of have to step on other people. So he tried to prevent that from happening. And the way to prevent that is to you should develop ways of trying to help each other during medical school. So that is one thing he teaches. And the second thing that he teaches is that when you become a doctor, so you will be expected to do well financially and socially and what have you. But then when you reach that position, you should give back to church and give back to society. So there is two things that I learned from medical school that I still remember. So we talk about this one, wealth, and so instead of like this guy who is just rich fool, we try to give back to church, give back to society, and serve others. Okay. Now the second item would be power and control and ambition. Okay. So this is the text, the Bible text is found in Luke chapter 22, from 25 to 27. So it's basically, it was talking about a dispute between the disciples, okay? So which one of us was considered the greatest, okay? So what did Jesus tell the disciples? That one was, I think in the Luke, okay, that's the setting was that seems like they were on the last night supper, okay, where Jesus just washed the feet and then they have this discussion. So that's what Jesus said, okay? The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. So the natural human motives and ambitions are to dominate and control others. So that is pretty natural. We all want to have our control. We want to dominate others. However, in God's kingdom, that's what Jesus said. You are not to be like that, okay? The greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rule should be like the one who serve. So basically, what Jesus was talking about is a servant leader. So it's basically what my medical schools associate dean kind of teaches. Tell us to be a servant leader. And Jesus was in fact making an example. Now Jesus was a teacher, right, and then master, but he said, I am among you as the one who serve. Now, and then he asked, who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? It is not the one who is at the table. So the people who are the ones sitting down being served, they are supposed to be the greater one. But then Jesus was setting an example for the disciples by washing their feet. So now we talk about these two, wealth and power, okay? The next item that we will go on would be our name and reputation, which is pretty important for us, okay? Hypocrisy, name and reputation. So our motivation factor is our reputation, but our character traits, Jesus talked about hypocrisy quite a bit, okay? So now we all like to have a good name and a good reputation, okay? Now that could be a pretty powerful motivational factor. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that, okay? However, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus proclaimed 7 woes on the teachers of the law, or scribes, okay, and the Pharisees, and publicly calling them hypocrites, okay? Now let's try to define certain works here. Woes, usually related to prophetic pronouncement of judgment, okay, in the Old Testament. The scribes are actually expert at handling written documents, like written documents, and they also taught and interpret and preserve the law, and they elaborate doctrine from the law. So they are more or less kind of like theologians today, to learn. So, but Jesus, when he talked about teachers of the law, it probably applied to all of us who teach today too, like me, okay? And then Pharisees, this is a conservative religious sect committed to fulfilling demands of the Old Testament through their elaborate oral tradition and scrupulous attention to the written and oral law. So the Pharisees, they were actually, a religious sect started sometime after the Babylonian exile, after they returned. And then they decide that they want to, because of the trauma that they went through during the exile. So they want to really take seriously in keeping the law of God, okay? And the way they do that is to try to develop a lot of rules and regulations, try to keep every, written and oral law. So, their intention is not bad. However, the way they do it is probably maybe over the board, okay? So because they try to really try to keep God law so that this exile thing would never happen to them again, okay? And then the term hypocrites, okay? In Greek, it is referred to like a play actor who put on race masks and play different roles, okay? Now, there are actually two words for hippo and crit. So hippo means under or below, and crit is kind of like judging. So judging yourself better than others. That is kind of like the definition of a hypocrite. Now Jesus talk about proclaim 7 woes, okay, prophetic judgment, okay, 7 woes on the scribes, teachers of the laws, and the Pharisees, okay. Now in 6 of these 7 woes, Jesus rebuked the religious leaders for what they did, okay, and whereas in one of them, Jesus rebuked them for what they did not do, okay. Let's go to the 6 okay. Basically, Jesus was making rebuke them for trying to focus on making themselves look good, okay. In woe number 5 and 6, Jesus used 2 different metaphors: cup and dish, which is clean outside and filthy inside, and whitewashed tomb, which is beautiful outside but rotten inside. So there are 2 metaphors of Jesus describe the Pharisees and the scribes as focused on making themselves look good. And then on 3 of those rules, 3 of those woes, Jesus kind of rebuild them for creating rules that shut people out of the kingdom of heaven, and then entrap people in hell. That would be number 2. And then they make elaborate rules about taking offs, okay, off. Okay, and then on row number 7, Jesus kind of rebuilding for honoring dead prophets, but murdering contemporary prophets. Okay, so they build tombs for the prophets, decorate the graves of the righteous, but then they kill the people, the prophets who is contemporary to them. So now the 4th woe, the one in the middle, was the one that is unique from the others in that it focused not on what the religious leader did, but on what they failed to practice, which is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And now I would like you to turn to the Matthew chapter 23, verse 23 to 24, and I would like to read, I would like one of you to read them. Matthew 23, verse 23-24. Yeah, verse 24. Yeah, what version do you read from? New King James. Do they use weightier matters of the law, or the weightier? Okay, in the NIV it say more important matters of the law. So more important matters of the law, or weightier, which is more heavy. You know, weightier means more heavy. What is the weightier matters of the law? Tell me. Okay, he pointed out. Okay, good. Okay, I would try to think of it as like the Ten Commandments or the covenant, right? So you can talk about both of them as law, right? But I would say the Ten Commandments would be the weightier matters of the law, which is, and then the covenant is the whole law, right? But the Ten Commandments is part of the covenant, right? So the Ten Commandments is the part of the covenant that embodies the moral character of God, which would be what? Love, mercy, faithfulness, justice, and righteousness. So these are different but related aspects of God's character. So I'm looking at this, the weightier matter of the law, I'm looking at it as at a point that it is actually part of God's character. And it is, in fact, central aspect of God's character.
Actually, don't you think that when it comes to the character, I mean, the outward thing is indicative of the heart,
Right.
and that's why when Jesus expounded in Matthew 5 and Matthew 6 about, you know, he didn't come to destroy the law, but he came to give it greater meaning. And he talks about then it's not just the outward act of killing, it's the inward thoughts, you know, because that's where the outward action comes from. And so, you know, again, it has to do with where the heart and the mind are.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So, this is. So I would say this. Why is this being weightier, or more important? Is exactly because it is part of God's character. So and then, as you know, the prophet Micah said in Micah 6 verse 8, and what does the law require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Okay, so what does it mean by practicing justice and practicing mercy and practicing faithfulness? So, okay, bringing justice or practicing justice means bringing justice to those who are wrong, and giving mercy and practicing mercy would be giving mercy to those who do wrong. Okay, and then for faithfulness is kind of a term in relation to God's covenant. You know, God being faithful, and we need to be faithful to God. So faithfulness is a term. It's kind of like a bilateral relationship between God and His people. So how we can remain faithful to God's covenant and obedient to His law. So now the Ten Commandments, I would say, is a general guiding principle to be applied in various situations. Now, where the Pharisees was wrong in that they try to come up with many different rules, try to apply, you know, in every situation in life. It's very hard to do. You know, the Ten Commandments is a general principle, but we have to apply it into individual situations. And then
don't you think we as Adventists have been guilty of that ourselves?
Well,
in you know, in having so many rules. I mean, at least in my generation, we grew up with a bunch of rules of what you could and couldn't do, and you know.
Yeah, we probably have done that, but what I like to focus on is some of the Bible stories. Okay, now we don't have time to go through all this, but I just want to bring this up for us to think about. Okay, 2 weeks ago we talked about the story of Cain and Abel. Okay, So did God treat both Cain and Abel both justly and mercifully? Okay. So we don't have time to argue this, but something that I want to raise. And then next week we will talk about David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. Does God treat David, Bathsheba, and Uriah both justly and mercifully? Okay. Do you have a comment? Do you want to say something? Huh? Oh, okay. All right, okay. Okay, other examples are King Ahab, Jezebel, and Bob, take over his vineyard. And then King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar. So on each of these stories, we should ask whether God treat these people both justly and mercifully. See, the point I want to make here is that we don't have time to cover every one of these stories today. But my key point is that practicing justice and mercy is not as simple as following a simple rule like paying tithe, okay? Paying tithe 10%, is pretty simple rule. But then when we are talking about justice and mercy, a lot of time the stories is a little bit more complicated. And so we probably have to really study God's word to find out what God's priority for us is, okay? And finally, I just want to have a word about paying tithe, okay? Because this talk about tithe. So Jesus noted that the religious leader, they pay very careful attention on paying a tenth of what they have. Even to the smallest of the garden crops like herb, mint, dills, and cummins. However, Jesus was not condemning them for doing that, okay? In fact, he stated you should have practiced the latter, meaning justice, mercy, and faithfulness, without neglecting the former, that means paying tithe, okay? So now in verse 24, Jesus used another metaphor, okay? Straining out a net but swallowing a camel. So today we are not really quite sure what they are talking about. But usually, if we say if you have a cup of water, okay, some insects or flies fell into the cup of water. Well, today we just get rid of the cup of water, just get another cup. But in those days, in Palestine, water is a very precious resource. You don't just throw them away, okay? So what they do is that they will remove the fly or the net here, and then they will still drink the water. So Jesus, now both the net and the camel are like unclean, okay? Those are unclean food based on Leviticus. But what Jesus was trying to compare it was that by them straining out a net is kind of comparable to follow the rules on paying tithe, but swallow a whole camel is like comparable to like them neglecting the more important matters of law, like mercy, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So here Jesus is basically speaking in metaphor. Okay. Any other comments on that? Okay. If not, then we can keep moving on. Let me just take a look at the time. How much time I have? Okay. Okay. Now the next section I would title is Being Worthy of Jesus. Now let's turn to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. Now could someone read for me verse 37 to 39?
37 to 39.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He who loves the father or mother more than he loves me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life shall lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake shall find it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so here Jesus talked about 3 more motivational factors, okay? And then each of these 3 factors has their own conflict points. So let us go to, the 3 factors are the following. First, family relationship, okay? Second is our own personal physical comfort, okay? And the last motivational factor would be my own life, okay? And then what are the conflict points, okay? For family relationship, the conflict points is love and loyalty to Jesus versus love and loyalty to our own loved ones. That means our own father, our own parents, spouse, and children, okay? So love and loyalty to Jesus on one side, and love and loyalty to our own household, okay? So, and then if you go back to verse 34, Jesus was saying that he actually came to bring a sword, not peace. And then verse 36, he said, a man's enemies would be members of his own household. Now I have, I'll talk a little bit about more this later, okay? Now, so the next motivational factor would be our own personal comfort, personal well-being. Now, the conflict point would be taking my cross and follow Jesus, okay? So, on one hand, we like to live comfortably, but on the other hand, we have to carry our own cross. That is what Jesus said. So we know that now we sometimes we are aware of brothers and sisters of ours who face the loss of their jobs because their employers would not respect or accommodate their religious liberties, okay? That can be a very serious problem because it directly affects the people's livelihood and well-being, okay? Sometimes it happens, we know that it happened in this country, okay? But, okay, now carry a cross over long distance, whether it was done for oneself like Jesus or for others like Simon of Cyrene, would be a very unpleasant task, very unpleasant experience, okay? Say if I was suddenly, like Simon, seized by Roman soldiers to take the cross and carry it over 1 mile on behalf of Jesus, would I be doing so willingly, or would I be like cursing my own bad luck, like carrying a cross? I just put myself to the situation where Simon was like in Roman situation, Roman soldiers actually have the legal authority to just grab someone to just carry for them something, okay? So, and then the last motivational factor would be my own life, and the conflict point would be finding my life or preserving my life versus losing my life, okay? Now, if you look at Sunday's lesson on page 27, tells us that this Bible passage is really about allegiance and loyalties, okay? When forced to make a choice between following Jesus and protecting our own lives, livelihood, properties, or well-being, or our own family and our loved ones, what we do, okay? Now, so far, so on this point, I like to maybe just take a focus, look at between what we hear in America and other parts of the world, okay? In America, we are very fortunate to live here in America, where we enjoy a relatively high degree of religious liberty. For us, this Bible passage from Matthew 10, verse 34 to 39, seems like kind of like an academic thought exercise because it sounds so unreal and alien to our own experience here. I don't know if you have the same feeling because we don't really usually see people losing their life or losing their family because they want to become a Christian, here in America. But however, what we have to know is that we cannot really take our religious liberty for granted. Now, we know that American culture is becoming more secular, and sometimes it becomes more hostile to the Christian ethics, worldview, and practices, okay? I remember Pastor Phil recently preached a sermon about the challenge of a secular culture some weeks ago. Now, our religious liberty can be chipped away from us gradually, or can be taken away very suddenly. So we therefore have to remain alert, keep watch, and be prepared. Okay. Now we focus on America. Now, just a word about other parts of the world. Okay. Now, in other parts of the world, the situations of Christians are a lot more dire. So Christians face severe discrimination, persecution, and violence frequently and regularly. So resulting in the loss of life, livelihood, properties, and family relationships. Some of the government authorities are probably too weak to protect their Christian minorities, whereas other governments are actually active participants in persecuting Christians. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the last point that would be found in the book of Philippians. Okay. The church of Philippi. Okay. Now we know that from Acts chapter 16, from verse 11 to 38, I'm not going to read the whole passage. Okay, the church of Philippi. Philippi is a Roman colony and leading city at the district of Macedonia. Okay, so when Paul went there, he was just there for not too long. So there were three significant events. So one is conversion of Lydia. The second one is that he drove out a spirit out of a slave girl. So the owners brought Paul and Silas before the magistrate and accused them of throwing our city into an uproar by advocating custom unlawful to us Romans to accept or practice. So this is verse 20 to 21. So you know that kind of sowed the seed of religious persecution, because this Paul and Silas, he come and, they drove out the spirit of a slave girl, but then now it kind of maybe sowed a seed for some religious persecution, to the Christians. And then the last story in Philippi would be the conversion and baptism of the jailer and his family. Now when Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, he was in jail somewhere, in chapter 1, verse 13 and 14, he was describing that he was in chains, okay? So possibly he was in Rome. The Philippian church sent a man named Epaphroditus to take care of Paul's need, okay? So actually, the Philippian church actually tried to help Paul, when he was in jail. Now, on the letter of Philippians, Paul talked about two main issues, okay? The first issue is external opposition, and the second issue is internal dispute. So, in the church, okay? External opposition to the church and internal dispute in the church. So, now in chapter 1, verse 27 to 30, Paul encouraged the Philippians to stand firm and contend for the gospel in one spirit and as one man. So here, Paul himself, he was in jail. He was suffering for Christ. But then he wrote this letter, and then in verse 29 to 30, chapter 1, verse 29 to 30, he wrote, For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. So basically, both Paul and the Philippian church are suffering. They come under some opposition from the outside, from the outside world. So external. So they try to identify with each other, for the suffering. Now, how do you identify with persecuted Christians? I would say, pray for them. Okay. Second, educate yourself about the plight. Now we have internet, so it's not too hard for us to educate ourselves what's happening around the world. And then third, to send some aid or resource to them if possible. Okay. Now, and Saul himself, when he was heading over to Damascus to persecute Christians, Jesus, when Jesus was talking to Saul, he also identified with those who persecute for his sake, right? So what did Jesus say? I am Jesus. Okay, he fell to the ground. Let me read this. So Acts chapter 9, verse 4 and 5. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. So here we know that Jesus actually identified with people, with people who are persecuted for his sake. Okay, now the next passage in the book of Philippians talks about some internal disputes. Apparently there were two women, okay? The name are Erodia and Senche. That is from chapter 4, verse 2 and 3, who have contended in my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement. So we kind of read between the lines. There were some internal disputes in the church, and then the dispute apparently became pretty serious, that Paul has to actually address the issue, actually address the issue with names, okay? So Paul asked them to overcome the dispute with one another. Okay, let's read Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. Philippians chapter 2.
Verses 2 through 4.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on the one purpose. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others.
Okay, thank you. So the points are pretty clear here. Paul was telling them, whenever they have like internal disputes, so do nothing out of selfish ambition. Well, I kind of wrote this from NIV. Selfish ambition of vain conceit, in humility consider others better than yourself, and look also to the interests of others. So just look not only for ourselves, but for the interests of others. So, and then verse 5, Paul urged them to adopt the attitude of Christ, adopt in their mutual relations the same attitude that characterized Jesus. Okay, that's verse 5. So what are the attitudes of Jesus? We can keep reading from verse 6 to 11. So can you read.
Who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to the death on a cross.
Okay, thank you. So Christ's attitude, this is his attitude. Well, basically, Jesus was equal with God. Christ's equality, he is divine. So he is equal with God. But then he did not consider equality with God was something to be grasped, or another way of translating would be something to be exploited or to be taken away. You know, when I was in Hong Kong, my father was the principal of the school, so I'm a little bit kind of like, I can take advantage of this, But Jesus did not do that. Jesus, with we are talking about Jesus' attitude, okay? Even though he was equal with God, he did not make this something, but instead he condescended into humanity, okay? So basically, he became a servant or a slave. That is how you can translate it. So in Jesus, divinity and servanthood are not mutually exclusive. They can be one. So, and then he even died on the cross, suffering the lowest and cruelest form of Roman execution. So, and then verse 9 to 11 is about Christ's exaltation. So, but this exaltation, God did it to him. He did not seek exaltation himself. So I just want to conclude and summarize today's lessons with four points, okay? First point, put God's priority as our own priorities. Second point, follow the example and attitudes of Christ in our dealing with those around us. Point number 3, look not only to our own interests, but also to the interests of others. And then point number 4 would be to identify with those who are suffering persecution, especially those who are persecuted for Christ. So that would be the close of my lesson. Any other comments? Or let's just have a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this lesson today that tell us what your priorities for us are, and help each one of us to follow the example of Christ, both in our attitudes and in our actions, and help us to care about not just ourselves and for others too. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.